You were right. I did lie to you. I shouldn't have. All I can say is that if you get this...
What's happening? My name is goukigod, and in this video I'm going to be reviewing Resident Evil 7 on the PS4. Now I played through it without VR, so this review will be based purely from a non-VR perspective. So if you don't have VR and you're wondering if the game is worth buying without it, then this is definitely the review for you. I've also tried to keep this review as spoiler-free as possible, so I'm not going to discuss any plot details, puzzle solutions, or characters in any detail. Having said that, it's impossible to show gameplay without giving away something in a game like this. I've tried my best not to ruin any key moments, but if you're like me and you want to experience it with as little prior knowledge as possible so that you can get the most out of it, then I'd highly recommend not watching this review or any other review for that matter before you play it. That way, all the mystery and scares will have the biggest impact. All you need to know is that it's a decent horror game and a worthy addition to the series if you're a fan of the original games. For everyone else though, let me explain that last statement in a little bit more detail. Fuck. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard is the first game in the series in a very long time to scare me. Sure, 5 had moments of creepiness, but it wasn't particularly scary, and the little that I played of 6 felt a very long way off what I loved about the earlier games. In a lot of ways, 7 is a return to the series' roots, and as a result it's a return to form. It takes the best elements from the original games and blends them with modern horror game ideas and techniques to create something that isn't always original, but is pretty enjoyable nonetheless. On the surface, the events in Resident Evil 7 don't appear to be linked in with the rest of the Resident Evil universe. Whether it does or doesn't, you'll have to find out for yourself, but I will say that it's one of the more interesting storylines so far. All of the characters introduced at the beginning of the game are new, and you don't get given much of a backstory either. All you're told is that you're Ethan, a regular guy who's on his way to rescue his missing wife after receiving a strange message from her. This brings him to an old and presumably abandoned house in Dulvey, Louisiana, where all kinds of strange things are happening. You soon learn that the house is far from abandoned, and as you make progress you'll discover what exactly happened to Mia. The backstory of the other characters is also drip-fed through short cutscenes, playable flashback sequences, and numerous objects littered around the environment. You can find heaps of additional information through these items too, such as notes, much like in the original game, so it's well worth scouring every room to get the entire story. Thoroughly searching each area is actually a key component of the gameplay. You need to be really thorough to make sure that you've collected every resource, clue, and other item that's available. This is sometimes essential in order to progress, but looking properly is often rewarded with useful goodies like health and weapons. Now, it's not always practical or convenient to properly detail an area on your first visit, so backtracking to make sure that you've got everything is an absolute necessity. There's also plenty of hidden trophies to collect and Easter eggs for those devoted enough to find them. In a lot of ways, the game design is very similar to Alien Isolation. For example, most of the time you're underpowered, so avoiding danger is often the safest if not the only strategy. You don't always know where danger might be hiding either, which makes exploration both nerve-wracking and quite slow at times. You'll also need to craft equipment and weapons from what you can find. There's never enough of what you need, so managing your inventory is really important. A common issue is choosing whether to craft first aid or something like ammunition from the limited items you have. You can only carry so much too, which makes it really easy to get caught without enough space for a critical item that you find in your travels. Like in the previous games, you can also save items in chests that are scattered around in various locations. Now you can access any item from any chest regardless of which one you saved it in. It's not terribly realistic, but it does eliminate the need to backtrack across a large and potentially dangerous area if you need something. Thankfully, chests and save points are conveniently placed together and their locations are frequent enough that I never felt like either were hard to get to. Now, the inventory system that manages both the items on you and in chests is an improvement on the earlier games, but it's still deliberately cumbersome to make certain situations even more stressful. Trying to combine items mid-boss fight to make more first aid is a good example of this. Thankfully, there are shortcuts for some items like weapons and healing, so combat stays reasonably fluid provided you've equipped what you needed beforehand. Another element that feels similar to Alien Isolation is the save system. You can only save using cassette recorders, which, as I mentioned before, are found in fixed positions throughout the environment. There's no autosave or ability to pause and save, so it's easy to lose progress if you get careless or overconfident. I think this is either a mechanic you love or hate, or in my case, love to hate. I personally think that it adds to the tension. It's not quite as punishing as it is in Isolation either, because the saving process is much quicker. You also seem to be able to do it at any time, unlike in Isolation, which would stop you from saving under certain conditions. It still ups the stakes though by adding an additional element of risk and reward into the strategy. Now, one of the areas that I don't think works so well is the boss fights. Some of them are incredibly difficult, and while I don't mind a challenge, I don't like having to die multiple times before figuring out the solution. Not all boss fights are painful to fight, to be fair, but there was one in particular I felt wasn't very fun, and it actually made me rage quit. The bosses are also a lot tougher than the rest of the enemies, which I guess fits into the context of the game design in that they're almost like a puzzle, but more often than not I didn't really enjoy fighting them. The other main area of beef I had is with the AI, or to be more specific, the distance at which enemies can spot you. You can get reasonably close to most enemies, and unless you're in their direct line of sight, they won't see you. When you are seen, they don't pursue you very far either, they generally just stick to their designated patrol area. A technique that works, which is kind of disappointing that it works, is closing a door behind you when you run away because most enemies won't open it. I did have one other minor issue with the game, and that's that noise doesn't seem to attract enemies. I hate to keep making comparisons to Isolation, but it would have been way more terrifying if staying quiet was important. In plenty of instances, I fired my gun within earshot of an enemy and there was absolutely no consequence. I really like how in Isolation how firing a weapon or making a noise always attracted unwanted attention, and you really had to decide if making noise was worth the risk. Like I said, this is just a minor gripe, and there's plenty to like about the game, such as the puzzles. And puzzles return as a major component of the gameplay. Now, there's plenty of head scratches that need to be beaten throughout the game in order to progress. In general, I didn't find them to be particularly challenging, except for a few that simply required a bit more investigation. What I did like though is how some areas stayed locked until quite deep into the game. When you finally have the tools to access them, it's up to you to remember where they were and what they did, as not every area needs to be unlocked to progress. So let's talk about the presentation. Most of the time, it looks and sounds great. The lighting, environments, level design, and the overall art direction is excellent, and it does a really good job at making you feel uneasy. I particularly like the depth of field effects and the camera acceleration, which apparently is making quite a few people sick. The fact that so much of the game takes place in a big spooky house is such a throwback to the first game, and I think fans of the original will get a real kick out of it. Some of the environments and set pieces feel like they've been lifted straight out of the Silent Hills playable teaser, and that's definitely not a bad thing. In many ways, this game feels like a spiritual successor to PT. These similarities could totally be a coincidence, or maybe it's a nod to that game, but either way, it's awesome. There are a few occasions where the visual presentation falls flat, with the occasional texture looking muddy. I also came across a few instances where textures took a while to load in. It's never game breaking and it's not a massive issue, but it does take you out of the moment every now and then. Now, the big question for a lot of people, I think, is it scary? Now, a quick search on YouTube will show that there's a ton of Let's Play videos out there with people overreacting, but theatrics aside, I did spend a lot of the game with my heart pounding like I just run a marathon. To its credit, there aren't that many jump scares, it's more the anticipation of what's hiding in the darkness rather than the scares themselves. There are jump scares, of course, but these are well earned due to the game's excellent atmosphere and sound design. It also has excellent pacing, and although it does lean pretty heavily on some well-established horror tropes, it works well overall. The first-person perspective wasn't something I thought I'd like first either, being an old-school Res fan. To me, Resident Evil has always been an over-the-shoulder third-person experience, but reducing the field of view makes it feel much more intimate. This combined with the generally slow controls makes for a pretty tense experience. You can increase the look speed, but the speed at which Ethan actually walks and runs is painfully slow. Seriously, if the game doesn't win an award for anything else, it should win the award for slowest run speed ever. Resident Evil 7 is part Silent Hills, part Alien Isolation, but most importantly, completely Resident Evil. A lot of the ideas that seem lifted from other games you could argue were actually in the original, and that they're the imitators and not the other way around. Either way, Resident Evil 7 is an excellent addition to the franchise and a huge relief for anyone who thought the series had nothing left to give. If you like scary, challenging games, then definitely pick this one up.